The Black Depth Charge, the submarine captain who held the key to World War III. Blast hits like a hammer, lights flicker, sweat drips from noses onto steel. Someone shouts that the air's gone bad. Another concussion rolls the hull, valves rattle, a gauge needle quivers into red. "It's started," a voice says. Captain Savitsky snaps, "Prepare the special torpedo." The political officer nods. 2 votes. Hands move, warhead locks, gyro settings, the awful routine of the irreversible. Then Arkhipov, calm, hoarse, firm, says no. He won't consent. 1 vote short of Armageddon. Depth charges thud again. 30 men hold their breath. Why did this one officer have the power to stop it, and why did he use it? Set up, the ocean becomes a chessboard. October 1962 felt like a held breath. Missiles in Cuba moved the front line to within minutes of American cities. Washington called it a quarantine, not a blockade. Lawyers argued words while destroyers fueled and pilots slept in flight suits. Moscow pushed its wager across the Atlantic under cover of freighters and silence. Both sides primed and waiting, each convinced the other would blink. To understand why a Foxtrot-Class diesel boat was suddenly the hinge of history, you have to see the board as the Kremlin saw it. The Soviet plan leaned on ambiguity. 4 diesel-electric submarines, B-59 among them, would slip under the quarantine line, skirting US screens. Each carried 1 weapon meant to balance overwhelming American naval power, a T-5 nuclear torpedo, roughly Hiroshima in a steel cylinder. The idea wasn't to use it. It was to keep the US honest if things turned ugly. But these weren't silent, tireless nuclear subs. Foxtrots were loud at speed and slow when submerged. Batteries drained fast. Heat and carbon dioxide built up. After a day or 2 down, the atmosphere got sticky, sour, and dangerous. On paper, B-59's mission profile looked doable. Stay hidden, conserve power, surface at night to charge, receive orders, proceed. In practice, every variable turned slippery the moment they crossed into the US Navy's hunting ground. The Americans built a net. Carriers and destroyers stitched together a moving wall with sonar pings and patrol planes. The Doctrine said, "Don't kill, signal. Use practice depth charges and signaling grenades, loud, scary, but not lethal, to tell an unknown submarine, 'We've got you, surface and identify.'" Memos went out. Frequencies, patterns, a choreography of pressure without blood. The catch, not every Soviet boat received that memo. Down in the heat, concussions felt like attack, not etiquette. Meanwhile, radio silence wasn't just a tactic, it was a trap. B-59 and her sisters were cut off for stretches that mattered. They could intercept scraps near the surface, civilian broadcasts hinting at tension. But once they dove, the world went dark. No way to verify a rumor, no way to confirm a threat. The orders carried phrases that sounded clear until you needed to use them. If fired upon, if war begins. How do you define either when the only language around you is metal slamming metal and a hull groaning like it wants to split? Inside B-59, command looked like a triangle held together by sweat and protocol. Captain Valentin Savitsky, young, intense, tasked with getting his boat through humiliation without losing face. Political officer Ivan Maslenikov, guardian of doctrine and morale, trained to read ideology into noise. And Vasily Arkhipov, chief of staff of the detachment, equal to the captain in rank, carrying a reputation earned a year earlier on a different submarine, where a reactor leak turned metal into poison and panic into casualties. He didn't talk much, but when he did, men listened. While that triangle squeezed through warm Atlantic layers, the US screen tightened. Sonar pings twitched nerves. A destroyer shadowed a contact, another cut across the predicted track, a third readied signal charges. The plan in Washington was to pressure, not provoke. The effect under the water was the opposite. Concussions slammed nerves already frayed by heat. Instruments jittered. Batteries bled. Code 2 scrubbers strained. Men rationed water and words. This was the moment when intent and perception parted ways. The Americans thought they were de-escalating. The Soviets on board read escalation. One detail would prove crucial later. The only way to answer the question, "Are we at war?" was to surface into hostile lights and guns. But surfacing meant admitting you'd been caught, handing control to ships with loudspeakers and spotlights. Pride and prudence pulled in opposite directions. They didn't know it yet, but the board was tilting toward a decision no manual could cleanly solve. K-19's Reactor Crisis. 3 summers earlier, a different steel box tried to swallow its crew. K-19, the Soviet Navy's new pride, ran cold water drills in the North Atlantic when a hiss turned into a warning that nobody wanted to hear. The primary cooling system failed. Reactor temperature climbed. Gauges crept past safe into guesswork. Men wiped frost from dials with hands that would soon blister from something they couldn't see. Arkhipov was executive officer then, second in command, quiet, methodical. He watched the captain take reports that contradicted each other. Some said the backup pumps could hold. Others said the backup didn't exist in any usable way. The ship had been rushed to sea. Welding seams were still bright. Red paint smelled fresh in the passageways. The plan was to improvise a cooling loop or accept a meltdown at sea. Stakes weren't abstract. K-19 carried missiles, but the immediate threat was the core cooking through its own metal. If that happened, the ocean wouldn't dilute it. It would boil around it. The crew would die first. Then the plume would ride currents and winds to places the map didn't warn about. The decision wasn't war versus peace. It was act now and maybe die versus wait and definitely die. Action was ugly. Sailors stripped pipes and bent them by hand, cutting fingers on burrs, taping leaks with cloth and prayer. They crawled into a compartment bathed in invisible fire and bolted a Frankenstein loop into place. They took turns, minutes per man. No hero speeches, just a list and a stopwatch. Arkhipov stood at the hatch counting down, making the list, arguing for a rotation so nobody stayed long enough to collapse inside. Meanwhile, something else was happening on deck. Panic knocked at the threshold. Rumors moved faster than orders. Men asked if they should prepare lifeboats, if they should surface and broadcast distress. The captain hesitated. Surface meant admitting failure and inviting foreign eyes. Stay down meant solving it alone or dying alone. Arkhipov pressed for clarity before irreversible moves. Surface to assess. Keep COMSEC tight. Don't broadcast unless the loop fails. He wasn't overriding. He was threading choices, so one didn't lock the next. Impact came in silence. The loop worked barely. Reactor temperature stopped climbing and began a slow, stubborn fall. The men who built it stumbled out with their hair already losing color, their skin showing a flush that would turn to burns. They vomited in buckets. Some couldn't stop shaking. The ship lived, but the crew absorbed the bill. Over the next days, men sickened. Some would die soon. Others would carry damage home under uniforms that fit looser. In the aftermath, Arkhipov walked the passageways listening more than talking. He saw what fear did to judgment, how it sped up clocks in men's heads and made any action feel better than the right action. He also saw the cost of waiting too long, how a 5-minute delay turned exposure from survivable to fatal. The lesson wasn't courage or caution. It was calibration. Demand proof before you push the irreversible button. Strip assumptions to the bolt. If you've got 2 bad options, slow the choice until reality tells you which one is actually worse. The Navy recorded a sanitized version. The accident became a line in a logbook and a medal that said service without saying where. But reputations moved through whispers. Officers noticed the XO who didn't flinch when the situation turned ambiguous. He didn't turn hard or bitter, he turned careful. In briefings after K-19, he asked questions about communication paths, about redundancies that only existed on paper, about who could say yes and who could say stop. Get this, one detail would travel with him. On K-19, acting fast without a full picture could have turned a catastrophe into a legend of blame. Acting slow would have killed them all. The thread between those poles was verification. Make the reactor numbers tell the truth. Make the sea state tell the truth. Make the world outside your hull tell the truth before you answer to it. When Arkhipov later climbed into B-59, that quiet math came with him. Not bravado, not defiance, just a habit. Before you choose the thing you can't undo, make sure you're not choosing a rumor. The submarine, B-59's design and limits. Foxtrot meant compromise. Long, cigar hull, double-skinned and stubborn, B-59 was built to patrol oceans the old way. Diesel on the surface or at snorkel depth, batteries in the deep. On charts it looked capable, 20+ knots if you didn't care who heard you, 8 or 9 on batteries if you did. But once she dipped below periscope depth and shut out the sky, every decision spent air, power and nerves. Inside, the boat was a metal intestine, tight bends, sweat-slick ladders, red bulbs to save night vision. 50+ men shared air that thickened by the hour. The numbers told the truth before your lungs did. Carbon dioxide crawled up, oxygen slid down. The scrubbers worked until they didn't, and the heat, trapped by a hull that was never meant for the tropics, pooled in compartments like a fever. Gauges read 45 to 60 degrees Celsius. Shirts turned to rags. Skin prickled. The smell, diesel, oil, damp canvas. Men settled into every screw thread. They carried one weapon that didn't belong on a diesel boat, a 650mm special torpedo with a nuclear warhead. The T-5 was last resort, rendered in steel. It wasn't for knife fights with destroyers. It was a lever, meant to move an adversary who thought he had every conventional advantage. The torpedo's logic was brutal. If you corner us and cut our options to none, we'll give you a reason to back away. In the Doctrine briefings, it made a kind of sense. In a heaving control room at 200 meters, with practice charges thumping like fists, sense felt thin. Crew life ran on rationed cycles. Battery charge dictated sleep, food, and temper. When the navigator plotted a course that promised an hour of quiet, men stole minutes with their eyes closed. When the engineer called for conservation, lights dimmed and fans slowed, and every breath felt heavier. Water was sips, not gulps. Food was hot when the galley could run stoves without starving the batteries. Noise discipline was a religion. A dropped wrench could feel like treason. The command triad sat within that pressure cooker, each man holding a piece of authority that overlapped just enough to rub. Savitsky's job was tactical. Keep the hull intact, keep the boat hidden, complete the mission. Maslennikov's was political. Prevent defeatist thought, enforce doctrine, ensure the captain's resolve didn't soften under strain. Arkhipov's authority was quiet but real. Flotilla chief of staff, senior across boats, carrying policy in his head and memory in his bones. On paper their zones were clear. In practice, a depth charge could smear those lines in an instant. Orders from shore had an engineer's elegance and a lawyer's trap. If fired upon, respond. If war begins, act accordingly. From a desk in Moscow, conditions had edges. Below the thermocline, everything blurred. Was a signaling charge a shot? Did an aircraft strafing the waterline count as an attack if the rounds weren't meant to pierce steel? Doctrine didn't sweat. Men did. Technically, B-59 could snorkel, raise a mast, run diesels, sip air and current. In the Caribbean, that was a noisy prayer. A snorkel mast betrayed you to radar. Diesel exhaust betrayed you to eyes. Even at night, a periscope's wake could give you away to patient destroyer 20 cables off your bow. So they went deep when they could, shallow when they had to, and every change in depth stole voltage they couldn't replace without risking a spotlight and a siren. Meanwhile, something else was happening inside the boat that no manual mentioned. Time distorted. The petty officer in sonar heard pings that seemed closer than they were. The helmsman felt turns that weren't there. The medic checked pulse rates that never slowed. Heat does that. CO2 does that. Concussions from above untied knots in the brain that training had tied tight. That's where breaks appear, in the gaps between procedure and perception. And then there was the torpedo room. Men kept their eyes on safety pins, seals, and the quiet, vulgar power sleeping in the special's warhead. The launch sequence was a staircase. Once you walked 3 steps down, unlock, align, flood, you needed a good reason to climb back up, and reasons were hard to hear under steel groaning and officers arguing in low, urgent voices. B-59's limits weren't just hardware. They were human. Every system routed through judgment, of a captain managing humiliation, a political officer reading signals through ideology, and a chief of staff carrying a memory of radiation burns. The boat could take a lot. The people inside it set the real ceiling. And in those days when depth charges stitched the water like punctuation, that ceiling felt low. The hunters, US signals that felt like war. While that pressure built inside B-59, the ocean above turned into choreography. The US Navy had rehearsed this, Find, fix, and force to surface without spilling blood. The playbook said, use practice depth charges, the petite cousins of the real thing, just enough explosive to be heard and felt, not enough to tear a hull. To sailors on destroyers, they were messages. To men in a steel tube, they were thunder without translation. The not kill doctrine came out of Washington briefings with neat phrases and clean diagrams. Destroyers would box a contact, maintain distance, and ping with active sonar to make their presence undeniable. Pilots in patrol planes would drop sonarbuoys in patterns that fenced the water, then call bearings like referees with whistles. Signal grenades, small underwater pops, would mark intention. We see you. Surface for identification. The goal was controlled pressure, a ladder with rungs before you reached violence. But there was one problem. The ocean doesn't carry footnotes. The memo that spelled out this signaling protocol didn't ride the thermocline down into a Foxtrot's control room. Some Soviet boats never received the guidance that Americans would use miniature depth charges as language. Even if a captain had heard rumors, concussions were not self-explanatory. A blast feels like a blast. A hull groans the same whether the charge is practice or live. Metal only speaks one dialect. On the American side, professionalism looked like restraint. The carrier group centered on USS Randolph kept its air wing on tight leash. Destroyers like USS Beale and USS Kenai held stations, swept arcs, and logged every ping, every drop, every flash of a searchlight in meticulous watch bills. Officers argued over decibel levels and standoff ranges, calibrating just enough noise to be undeniable. They thought they were steadying the edge. Unknown to them across the thermocline, the effect landed as escalation. In B-59's sonar shack, pings stacked into a wall. The operator's headphones crackled with returns, each one a needle jab. In the torpedo compartment, the floor plates vibrated as charges stitched the water. Pop, pause, closer pop, then a nearer one that made the lights tremble. A sailor tightened his grip on a handrail and tasted copper in his mouth. He didn't know that the powder loads were minimum. He knew his ribs, felt the sea being punched. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the air. US patrol planes flew low passes, searchlights stabbing the waves for a periscope feather. From the conning tower of a surfacing sub, that light is a hard slap. Arkhipov would later describe aircraft overflights at gut-level altitudes, automatic cannon fire chattering into the waterline, warning bursts to keep a boat honest. From a destroyer's deck, those tracers wrote, "Don't try anything." From below, they traced, "We're under fire." This was the moment everything changed in perception. The US intended to box the foe and offer an exit. Come up, identify, charge your batteries, and clear out. But intent doesn't survive translation when the medium is explosive shock. On B-59, the pounding layered over heat and code 2 and rumor. In the wardroom, a whispered line moved from mouth to mouth. Washington must have attacked Cuba. There's no other reason for this fury. Back on the American bridge wings, junior officers practiced a new kind of patience. Orders were to avoid depth settings that could crack plates. A bosun's mate counted seconds on a stopwatch after each PDC splash, logging the interval like a metronome. The captain's binoculars tracked faint wakes that might be snorkel trails, then lost them to black water and glare. The plan was to flush, not finish. But there was one more complication: pride. Soviet captains had been told not to be paraded. Surfacing in the middle of a ring of destroyers meant humiliation, photography, and reports that would travel back to fleet headquarters. A political officer would have to account for morale on a boat forced into the spotlight. That made every American signal feel less like etiquette and more like a shove in the chest. What nobody knew at the time was how close the arithmetic ran. Each concussive hello shaved a little more patience. Each minute at depth nibbled away at battery reserve. Each pass by a patrol plane fed the story that war had begun. On one destroyer, a radio man joked that the Russians were being stubborn. Below, a machinist mate clutched a stanchion and thought about his wife's last letter, now damp with sweat in a locker. Meanwhile, something else moved the needle: the memo gap. Washington had cabled embassies. Admirals had briefed commanders. But in the chaos of deployment, not every Soviet flotilla commander passed the word down the chain, and not every boat copied it intact. So the most careful de-escalation scheme in the world reached its audience as percussion and glare. No legend, no legend key. The ripple effects were immediate and invisible. In B-59's control room, officers read the blasts as a counter. The signals compressed options until only two seemed left: surface into the teeth of a hostile circle or break out with the one weapon that could stun the pack. Above the waves, a destroyer captain checked the time and prepared another pattern, convinced he was buying safety. Below, a hand hovered over a switch that belonged to a different universe. Everything was about to change when that switch almost clicked. Inside the pressure cooker, 72 hours without air. By the second day, the air tasted like pennies. Men spoke in short bursts and saved breath like currency. Battery needles drooped, each degree of tilt a reminder that time wasn't passing, it was being spent. Fans coughed, then slowed. Heat pooled low and climbed. In the engine room, a machinist ran a rag over his neck and came away with salt you could pinch. Stakes were bone deep now. If they surfaced, they'd be ringed by searchlights and horns, photographed, ordered about in front of their own crew. If they stayed down, the boat would simply run out of breath. Pride against oxygen. Duty against numbers on a dial. Someone muttered that humiliation was survivable. Suffocation wasn't. He said it quietly, like a sin. Action took the form of rationing. The engineer dimmed lighting to a dull red smear and pulled non-essential loads off the bus. Galley burners went cold. Water became sips from dented cups. The medic watched lips dry and eyes gloss over. In the torpedo room, men worked slow to avoid spiking their own heart rates. Every movement was a negotiation with air. A petty officer timed ladder climbs and tried to keep jokes alive. They landed flat. No one had breath for laughter. Meanwhile, sonar harassment refused to fade. Pings walked the hull like footsteps above their heads. Practice charges stitched closer, then farther, then close again. The pattern of a hunter keeping contact and reminding them there was only one acceptable exit. The control room took on a rhythm. Count the seconds, brace, feel the tremor ride the frames, check needles, breathe shallow through cloth. The cloth trick barely helped, but ritual steadied hands. This was the moment everything changed internally. Hallucinations tiptoed in. A seaman swore he heard a phone ringing. Another thought he saw frost plume in the beam of a red lamp. Co-2 plays with vision and judgment. It turns shadows into signals. The medic knew the signs and pressed chalk tablets into cracked palms, whispering to keep panic from taking oxygen and order at the same time. One sailor fainted by the watertight door. Two men lifted him without the grunt that would steal from their lungs. Unknown to them across the Atlantic, diplomats measured adjectives. On B-59, rumors measured fear. Someone had caught a civilian broadcast days earlier, something about missiles and Kennedy and Khrushchev. By now it had grown teeth. The wardroom birthed a story. The Americans must have struck. Why else would destroyers behave like this? Without fresh signals, the rumor hardened into doctrine. Officers' dilemmas sharpened. The navigator's chart sweated under his forearms. He argued for a night surface, quick charge, minimal profile. The political officer countered with humiliation, photographs, morale. The captain paced in meter-long steps, turning on his heel like a metronome. Every quotient landed on the same denominator, batteries. The engineer's estimate shrank each time he ran it. Noise discipline cost them a chance to laugh. It bought them a little more silent time. Medical strain turned from background to foreground. Co-2 scrubbers were near failure, canisters chalking white on the edges. The medic bled a man's nose in the head to give him the shock of cool water and the illusion of a reset. It worked for 10 minutes. Eyes reddened. Headaches took root at the base of skulls. A junior officer rubbed his temples and misread a depth change, calling out a number 2 meters off. The helmsman corrected without comment. That's how fatigue shows up, not in grand errors, in tiny slips that add up. Meanwhile, something else was happening inside the captain. The harassment didn't feel like pressure anymore. It felt like contempt. The ladder of options had lost rungs. He could surface into a ring and be stage managed, or he could break the ring. His voice, when he gave orders, had the grit of someone already at the edge. He snapped at a rating, then bit the apology back. Commanders can't bleed weakness when the boat is starving for air. Arkhipov watched without spectacle. He slept in short slices, checked stations, asked the engineer to show him the numbers and make him believe them. He visited the torpedo room with its quiet, monstrous cylinder and asked about seals and pins. As if a small problem there could be a reason not to choose the big problem. He remembered K-19, the way fear made fast choices look like salvation until they hit reality. He kept asking the same question: what can we verify? Impact arrived as a cluster of near-simultaneous bangs that made the overhead shed dust. Lights dimmed, then steadied. A gauge needle jittered, then settled a hair lower than before. Men tensed, waiting for a leak that didn't come. The captain's jaw clenched so hard a tendon stood out. He called the political officer over and pointed with 2 fingers toward the torpedo room. The gesture was simple: readiness. What nobody knew at the time was that the last hours at depth would right the argument. The medic took pulse after pulse and made eye contact with Arkhipov. The look said, "We're at the edge." The engineer, voice measured, described battery voltage like a eulogy. The rumor of war had become a working assumption. The captain sensed he was being forced into the choice his doctrine authorized and his pride preferred. Everything was about to change when Arkhipov decided that before they chose suffocation or fire, they would choose air. The launch debate, 2 votes for fire. The order came clipped, like it hurt to say. Arm the special torpedo. The word special moved through the compartments with a chill the heat couldn't touch. In the torpedo room, hands went to practice places. Safety covers off, interlocks checked, the big 650mm tube becoming the center of the boat's gravity. A petty officer announced each step too loudly, as if volume could steady his breathing. Flood valves stood ready like decisions with handles. Stakes sharpened to steel points. From their perspective, the Americans weren't signaling anymore. They were herding. Every blast said you don't get to choose. For men who trained to avoid shame as much as defeat, the humiliation of surfacing under searchlights tasted worse than oil. The captain's logic was brutally clean. Break the ring, buy space, climb to air behind a curtain of chaos. And if war had started above, a deterrent strike wasn't a crime. It was obedience. Action accelerated. Captain Savitsky leaned over the attack periscope, well as if staring into an invisible horizon. He snapped at fire control, set gyro for nearest contact, short run, detonation depth shallow. The political officer, Maslenikov, stepped in at his shoulder, voice formal and steady, invoking doctrine and retaliatory measures in case of hostile action. He didn't use the word nuclear. He didn't have to. His consent made 2. What nobody knew at the time was how close the ladder was to its last run. The launch sequence, once walked, resists reversal. Unlock safeties, energize circuits, rotate inner doors. The torpedo itself is indifferent. It wants a path. The fire control officers moved like they were walking through syrup, disciplined, slow enough to avoid mistakes, fast enough to obey. A young sailor on the manual winder watched his knuckles go white and didn't loosen his grip. This was the moment everything changed because Arkhipov stepped into the space between order and execution. He didn't raise his voice. He used rank. Flotilla Chief of Staff, senior aboard, veto power on special weapons. This wasn't custom, it was protocol. He said no, and the word didn't echo, it landed. He followed it with reason. We cannot confirm war, we must surface to verify. K-19 lived in his tone without being named. Stakes tightened again. 2 votes was momentum, 3 was annihilation. The blasts didn't pause to let them argue. A near one shivered the overhead and showered dust. Maslenikov squared himself, citing political responsibility, accusing hesitation of weakness. He framed it as morale. The crew needed decisive action. Arkhipov reframed it as survival. They needed oxygen and facts. He pointed at the medic's tally and the engineers' numbers like exhibits in a trial. Action turned to a clash of cadences. Savitsky's speech was staccato, orders, corrections, the clipped code of command under pressure. Arkhipov's was even, an anchor line over the side. He asked fire control to state the step they were on. Interlocks disengaged. He asked what was next. Energize firing circuit. He said hold. The word tasted like mutiny to some ears, like sanity to others. The room's temperature didn't change, but the air felt thinner. Impact started immediate and human. A senior rating, loyal to the captain, shifted his stance toward the console. He wasn't going to fire on his own. He was going to be ready when the debate flipped. Another sailor, eyes rimmed red, risked a glance at Arkhipov like a drowning man spotting a rope. The political officer pressed again. Doctrine, retaliation, dignity. Arkhipov pressed back. If we're alive enough to retaliate, we're alive enough to surface. Verify, or you're shooting at shadows. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the captain. Pride and duty were welded together inside him, and the heat had softened that weld. He'd been forced for days, and forcing back felt like reclaiming command. Arkhipov didn't attack that. He offered a different kind of command. Choose the risk you can survive. He proposed a path. Surface with flags ready, engines idle, hatches cracked just enough to breathe, show no panic, acknowledge no fault. He made humiliation sound like control. This was the pivot. Savitsky's eyes cut to the engineer. Voltage. The answer came flat, minutes at most before instruments become lies. He looked to the medic. Men are at limits. He looked to Maslenikov. The commissar's jaw was set like a seal on a document. Then he looked at Arkhipov, who didn't blink. The silence lasted one beat too long, and in that beat the boat seemed to tilt. The captain swore under his breath, a word that released something. He swung to fire control and ordered safeties re-engaged. The petty officer's hands trembled, but the clicks came clean. He told the torpedo room to stand the special down to ready, not armed. You could hear the exhale ripple through steel. Maslenikov protested on principle, then deferred to the hierarchy he couldn't change. Impact rippled outward. The launch that would have rewritten maps had been one step away. Now it was a memory of a path not taken. The boat still shook with concussions, still simmered in heat, still starved for air. But the irreversible had been deferred. Arkhipov didn't celebrate. He moved to the periscope well, not to look. There was nothing to see at that depth, but to stand where the next decision would be made. He said the next word clearly, surface. The veto, why Archipov's no mattered. Protocol gave him the right, experience gave him the resolve. On boats carrying the special, fleet rules were blunt. The captain, the political officer, and the senior detachment officer had to agree unanimously before a nuclear weapon left the tube. On B-59, that third seat wasn't ornamental. As flotilla chief of staff, Arkhipov outranked the political officer and matched the captain. His voice wasn't advice. It was a key in a three-key switch. What nobody knew in that room except Arkhipov was how those rules were born from fear of exactly this moment. Fog, heat, concussion, and pride compressing judgment. K-19 had taught him the shape of panic. It talks fast, chooses quickly, then spends years paying the bill. The reactor crisis had branded one habit into him: verify before you cross the line you can't recross. In a compartment where men were seeing things in the heat shimmer, verify sounded like heresy. It was the only sane word left. He used structure before persuasion. He stated the rule, not his opinion. Unanimous consent or no launch. Then he added the gap they could close. They didn't know if they were at war. If they were, surfacing wouldn't change the outcome of a fight already started. If they waned, firing would start one. Either way, oxygen was the first requirement for command. The boat couldn't decide anything in air it couldn't breathe. Maslenikov pressed the political case hard. If the Americans were using force, Doctrine called for decisive response. Anything less looked like weakness, and weakness spread through a crew like mold. Arkhipov didn't contest the moral, he shifted the frame. Strength here wasn't a blast, it was control, choosing when and how to reveal yourself, staging the surface as a deliberate act, not a panic. He promised posture, not surrender. Flags ready, engines disciplined, no chatter, no begging. Savitsky was the hinge. He carried two loads at once, humiliation forced by a circle of destroyers and responsibility for every man's lungs. Arkhipov met him on ground the captain respected, procedure. He made the room say out loud where the firing sequence stood. When the answer came back, energized next, he forced a breath into the timeline. The pause wasn't mercy, it was leverage. In that thin slice, he laid out a sequence that preserved command. Surface, assess lights and signals, keep the special at ready, not armed, and if fire came, they had a weapon set and waiting. This was the moment everything changed, because no didn't sound like obstruction, it sounded like a plan. He learned on K-19 that men follow calm math when noise is loudest. He did the math in public. Battery minutes left. Code 2 thresholds crossed. Probability that the blasts were signals, not murder. He didn't guarantee safety. He guaranteed they wouldn't choose blind. Meanwhile, something else mattered. Hierarchy beyond the hull. Arkhipov wasn't just another officer aboard. He represented the detachment commander's authority, a bridge to the mission's original intent. The nuclear torpedo was last resort, not first exit. His presence reconnected the boat to that design. The political officer could argue morale. He couldn't overrule the chain that placed Arkhipov above him on questions of special weapons. Impact reached past B-59. Unanimous consent doctrine was a human fuse built into a machine that otherwise rewarded speed. In the worst hour of the worst day, that fuse held because one person insisted on lighting conditions before the spark. If he had caved to momentum, 2 votes rolling downhill, the launch would have been a product of acoustics and heat, not policy. His veto mattered because it reintroduced time into a room that had run out of it. There was another layer, face. Arkhipov gave Savitsky a way to keep it. Surfacing could look like command, not capitulation, if done on their terms. No frantic waving, no disorder, just a Soviet boat taking air, acknowledging nothing. That mattered to a captain who'd been pummeled for days. Pride wasn't the enemy, unmanaged pride was. He didn't crush it, he harnessed it. When the safeties clicked back on, the Veto had done more than stop a firing circuit. It reset the decision architecture. They would still meet searchlights and bullhorns and the hard theater of controlled hostility. But the special stayed in its cradle, the crew breathed, and the boat rose under a choice that belonged to them. In a crisis built from misread signals, the only clear signal inside B-59 was a steady word backed by rank, memory, and rules designed for this exact edge. Breaking the surface, the standoff that didn't explode. The bow lifted first, then the sail, then the deck plates shedding seawater like sweat. Hatches cracked. Air rushed in, raw, night warm and blessed. Men leaned helplessly toward it, swallowing, eyes half closed like they were drinking. The diesel exhaust caught in a few throats and still felt like mercy. Above, searchlights snapped on, cutting white lanes across black water and painting B-59 in hard edges. US destroyers were already in their circle, hulking silhouettes bristling with antennas and intent. A bullhorn barked something in English the crew couldn't parse. Flags moved on American masts, signal lamps chattered in tight bursts, and a siren whooped once, a reminder of who owned the surface. A helicopter thumped by at an altitude that made hats twitch. Nobody fired. That mattered more than anything said. Arkhipov stood with Savitsky at the conning tower combing. He kept his posture deliberate, chin level, hands steady on steel, eyes watching the geometry of ships instead of their guns. He leaned close to the captain, voice low, engines idle, minimal profile, no radio unless forced. He wanted dignity without provocation, oxygen without theater. He had to make restraint look like command. Signalmen went to work on both sides. A US lamp flashed the international code for surface and identify. B-59's reply was minimal. Hull number withheld, no chatter. A promise embedded in silence. We're here, not compliant. A destroyer slid across their bow at a distance that felt like a shove, then settled on station, angled just enough to block a clean escape. The water between hulls turned into a gritty stage. Stakes stacked themselves on deck. Any twitch could ripple into a story no one controlled. A jittery gunner on a US rail, a nervous sailor dropping a wrench on B-59's casing, a misread flagged tiny things with outsized gravity. Inside, with hatches dogged open, the boat's lungs filled. The medic took pulses that finally slowed. The engineer listened to diesels coughing to life for a controlled charge and calculated how much they could sip without shouting it with smoke. Meanwhile, skyward, patrol planes wrote lazy ovals. One strafed the waterline with warning bursts, tracers stitching bright lines into dark sea, kicking spray against B-59's plates. From the destroyer's bridge, it looked like vigor. From the Soviet conning tower, it looked like fingers on a trigger. Arkhipov measured Savitsky's jaw, saw the muscle jump, and said nothing that would sound like order. He offered timing instead. 5 minutes at idle, then a slow turn to present less profile to the nearest bow. This was the moment everything changed in tone. The Americans, satisfied they'd flushed a contact, shifted from chase to choreography. Searchlights steadied. Loudspeakers swapped commands for warnings. A launch bobbed near, camera ready. The temptation to shame was there. The order not to escalate held. On B-59, sailors stood straighter. No waving, no pleading, no rash gestures. A Soviet ensign snapped in the rotor wash and announced presence with the quiet arrogance of cloth. Communication found its groove in ritual. Flags, lamps, horn blasts, each with a meaning older than the men using them. A US destroyer requested course and speed. B-59 answered with a number that was true enough and a bearing that bent modestly away. Radio stayed silent, except for a clipped internal circuit. Battery charging, compartment status, deck discipline. Arkhipov kept the circle tight around decisions. No one spoke to Americans over voice. No one volunteered identity. Unknown to these ships, in Washington and Moscow, messages felt their way across desks. An offer on missiles, a face-saving phrase, a trade taking shape. At sea, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was the meter-by-meter proof that you could be pressed without breaking and seen without firing. In this thin theater, Arkhipov's restraint traveled the distance between hulls better than any word. Impact registered in small things. A US captain lowered binoculars a fraction. A Soviet helmsman let his shoulders drop. Diesel rumble smoothed as revs settled. Battery needles in B-59's control room inched up, tiny victories in glass. The special stayed in its cradle, safeties pinned, a silent possibility no lamp could signal. As the night wore on, the ring loosened by degrees. Not trust, fatigue and procedure. B-59 held her line, completed a cautious charge, and never offered a target beyond the silhouette she couldn't hide. The encounter, noisy and blinding, bled nothing but nerves. They'd surfaced into the arms of the enemy and found those arms full of rules. By dawn's smear on the horizon, the standoff had the feel of a story both sides preferred to forget. B-59 eased away under a veil of exhaust and salt haze. The destroyers kept station, but let water widen. No victory pennants, no boarding party, no gunfire. Just breathing men below a steel skin that had baked them into fever and almost into history's crater. They'd come up for air and found the war wasn't here. Yet. Secrecy and silence, the hidden heroism. When B-59 slid back under the waves and away from the lights, the story didn't come ashore with her. In the Soviet Navy, incidents like this didn't become legends. They became files. The Caribbean patrol was logged as routine under difficult conditions. Reports described encounters and harassment, then slipped into boilerplate. The word nuclear didn't appear. Crews signed non-disclosure pledges that felt less like ceremony and more like handcuffs. Back at base, debriefs were brisk and selective. Officers answered questions about navigation, battery use, discipline. Nobody asked, for the record, how close the firing sequence came. Nobody wanted to hear that a torpedo with a special warhead had been warned. The paper path preferred minor friction to mortal risk. In Soviet practice, heroism was collective, and mistakes, if they existed, were either buried or punished. Individual restraint didn't fit a parade. Stakes were not only political, they were personal. Men who cooked quietly in that hull went home to families who saw the weight in their shoulders and didn't get to know why. Wives washed uniforms sour with diesel and salt, and a heat that clung to cloth. Parents read letters that spoke about the ocean without saying anything. The crew was told, in effect, that the best acknowledgement was that nothing had happened. If you saved the world and no one could say it, had you saved it at all? Action took the shape of silence. Arkhipov returned to duty like he'd left for a training cruise. He accepted posts, took exams, wrote evaluations that praised steadiness and emphasized procedure. Behind closed doors, a few senior officers nodded a shade more respectfully in his direction. None of it translated into public medals. The closest thing to recognition was trust, assignments that assumed judgment forged under pressure, not splashed across newspapers. Meanwhile, across the ocean, American records built a different blindness. The Navy congratulated itself, partly with reason, on a signaling doctrine that had flushed subs without firing shots. Reports praised restraint, catalogued patterns of practice charges, refined checklists. But those memos didn't account for translation at depth. They didn't note that the signaling plan rested on a memo the other side might never have read. The ambiguity stayed cached in operators' folklore, not doctrine. This was the moment everything changed for memory. It didn't. The event vanished into the Cold War static. For decades, the closest the world got were rumors, scattered lines in sailors' reunions, a nod in a hallway, a phrase like "that night in the Caribbean," spoken with a peculiar quiet. The myth grew in fragments without dates, without the sober spine of documents. The crew carried sharper fragments. In kitchens and stairwells, after enough years had passed to dull fear, some men told micro-stories. A torpedoman would describe the click of a safety sliding back into place like a tooth returning to its socket. A medic would talk about the first breath of night air as a taste he couldn't find again, no matter how many times he stood on a pier. A machinist would admit he'd thought, for a minute, of the faces he'd never see, then willed the thought away because it wasted oxygen. Arkhipov didn't trade on those memories. He stayed the man who asked for verification, who checked the path between order and action for loose steps. He knew what recognition would cost. It would expose not just his restraint, but the system's gamble. Nuclear warheads riding on diesel boats into a communications blackout, orders written in ifs and thens that turned to fog under pressure. The Navy preferred the clean line. Mission conducted, contact managed, return successful. Soviet classification hardened the lid. Files were held tight, and the Cuban crisis narrative moved on to missiles and photographs, to Kennedy's speech and Khrushchev's letter, to Jupiter trades and victory claims. Submarines stayed in the footnotes, where steel feels safer as a statistic. Yet even under that lid, respect survived in the unofficial ledger. Among sailors, restraint under humiliation counts. Officers who'd heard enough to map the edges knew a veto had been exercised when momentum was rolling downhill. They didn't toast it. They remembered who had the habit of saying wait and the authority to make it stick. The irony was sharp. A decision that kept the world from learning a new vocabulary for ruin had to stay unspoken to keep careers intact and strategies unchallenged. The hidden heroism wasn't just the no in a boiling control room. It was the long quiet that followed, the choice to let the saved world forget what it owed, because remembrance would cut too close to how it almost lost itself. Declassified threads, how the story emerged. For decades, the closest anyone got were whispers. Then the dam cracked, slowly. After the Soviet Union dissolved, veterans started showing up at small conferences with memories that didn't fit the official story. In the 1990s, Moscow hosted gatherings where retired submariners compared scars. A radio intelligence officer mentioned a night when men nearly blacked out from heat. Someone else said the special had been prepared. No one used the word nuclear into a microphone, but the word hung in the room anyway. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the United States. Archival boxes that had slept through administrations came up to the light. Anti-submarine warfare logs, deck logs, sonobuoy patterns, and memos about signal depth charges. The paper trail of a doctrine that insisted pressure could be polite. Staffers at the National Security Archive in Washington requested everything with the words Foxtrot, Caribbean, Randolph, and PDC. The story didn't walk out intact. It came in pieces. Times, bearings, explosive loads, the choreography of a hunt that believed itself bloodless. This was the moment everything changed, because the fragments connected. American records showed a ring of destroyers flushing a contact on October 27, the worst day of the crisis. Russian veterans fixed that date to their own worst hour. The puzzle snapped into an outline. B-59, boxed and deaf, prepared its one weapon that wasn't supposed to be used. Then a name began to surface in articles and panels, Arkhipov, tied to a veto word in a room lit by red lamps. Key confirmations arrived not as fireworks, but as dry facts that made the hair on your arms rise. The unanimous consent rule for nuclear torpedoes wasn't rumor, it was doctrine on those boats. B-59 did carry a 650mm T5 with a nuclear warhead. The captain and political officer wanted to fire. The launch sequence had moved past safeties. Only one senior officer's refusal held the line until the boat rose to breathe. The picture that had felt like a legend hardened into an event. Unknown to most readers at the time, a slim, careful account from Arkhipov himself existed, an official presentation that somehow avoided the word nuclear while describing searchlights, strafing bursts into the waterline, depth charges, and a captain blinded on the bridge. When translated and published by researchers, it gave bones to the myth. You could hear the cadence of the night in the way he stacked details. Range of the overflights, count of shells, the way destroyers cut across the bow at a dangerously small distance. It wasn't poetry, it was testimony. US Navy officers weighed in too. Some were proud that nobody pulled a trigger. Others admitted, in polite journal language, that the signaling plan assumed the other side knew it was a plan. Deck logs recorded patterns of practice charges and the restraint not to roll in real explosives. But you can sense, between lines, the unease of a doctrine that sounds humane in a briefing room and lands like war in a pressured hull. Scholars fought over the seams, because that's how truth gets trued up. Was the firing circuit fully energized? Were inner doors rotated? Which destroyers were closest? Did the aircraft fire only warning bursts? Minute-by-minute reconstructions multiplied. Some logs didn't match by 10 minutes. A recollection placed an illumination flare where a deck log placed a sonobuoy. None of it cracked the core sequence. It just reminded you that memory is a lens and paper is a filter. There were gaps that wouldn't close. Exact wording of orders transmitted before sailing, phrases about if fired upon. If war begins, came to us second-hand, from training briefings and later compilations, not the original signal cards. A few critical logs were missing in the bureaucratic sense, misfiled, lost, or never written the way we wish they had been. Veterans were honest about forgetfulness. Heat and fear blur edges. Historians labeled uncertainty instead of papering it over. Still, the arc held. 4 Foxtrots left Kola Bay with 1 nuclear-tipped torpedo each. On Black Saturday, US ships found one of them, hammered with signals that felt like blows, and nearly triggered the weapon meant only for last resort. A vote system designed to be a brake actually braked. The boat surfaced. The world kept spinning. It's not romance. It's a chain of verifiable steps with human fingerprints on every link. And then came the counterweight, the caution not to turn one man into a saint and a system into a cartoon. Veterans insisted the captain wasn't reckless, the political officer wasn't a caricature, and Americans weren't villains. Everybody did what training and pride told them to do under conditions no one had fully tested. The miracle wasn't purity, it was restraint strong enough to survive heat, noise, and humiliation. The longer the declassified threads lay in public, the more one idea stood out. This story existed because both sides kept records and some people chose to talk. It also existed in spite of the things neither side wanted to say. The closest we get to certainty is the moment the safeties click back on and the boat rose into light. Beyond that, we live with edges, which is fine. The edges prove this isn't myth polished smooth. It's history with ragged cuts, and those cuts are where the truth breathes. The unthinkable, if the torpedo had fired. Start with the nearest hull. The target would be the closest destroyer holding station, short run, shallow detonation depth. A 10-kiloton T-5 doesn't behave like a conventional warhead. It turns water into a hammer. The shock front slams plates, snaps frames, and throws steel like toys. The ship disappears not in flame, but in a geyser of sea and wreckage. Hundreds of sailors gone in seconds. No ambiguity left on the surface. Only a boiling patch and a radio net erupting with broken voices. Stakes jump instantly from tactical to planetary. On those decks, officers had standing orders for this nightmare. Reports flash to the carrier's flag plot. A watch officer's pen digs a groove as he writes the word nuclear. Within minutes, a message rides a tight circuit to Washington. Simultaneously, in the task group, the ladder of response is climbed 2 rungs at a time. Nuclear depth charges exist in the US inventory. Pilots can vector for a kill. The group doesn't need to debate whether someone has crossed a line. The hole in the water is the argument. Action in the first hour looks like instinct honed by drills. Destroyers tighten the ring and go lethal. Sonar operators drop their voices an octave and call bearings. Weapon teams set real depth charges, not practice. A helicopter throws a marker flare that dances on spray and paints a target circle. The carrier's air wing readies aircraft with ordnance meant to end pursuits, not conversations. In a CIC, somebody whispers DEFCON 2, like invoking weather. In Omaha, glass doors open at Strategic Air Command. Crews jog, not sprint, because sprinting wastes thought. Meanwhile, something else is happening in Cuba. Soviet troops around the missile sites in the west of the island are already keyed up. News of a US destroyer vanishing by nuclear blast won't arrive clean. It'll arrive as a roar. Local commanders interpret it as the opening salvo of an invasion and prepare to fire if attacked. In Havana, phones ring fast enough to shake tables. In Moscow, generals read the Torpedo as a small nuke detonated against the Soviet Union's defensive presence. And they write retaliation in their heads while waiting for a line to open. This was the moment everything changed, because the strategic logic trap would spring shut. The United States believes it has absorbed a nuclear strike against its ships. The Soviet command believes its forces are under assault and that a local commander used a last resort weapon as authorized. Both doctrines promise to respond, not pause. The president's circle huddles over a table already covered with maps. The word proportional is said out loud, then loses its meaning in a room where proportionality includes nuclear depth charges and strikes on launchers. On the water, the immediate impact is brutal and limited by physics. A chain of charges walk down a bearing can split a hull or stun a crew into drowning in their own boat. If B-59 takes another step, fires again, the group will blanket the ocean with explosions until nothing moves. The other Foxtrots, hearing fragments and seeing the sky go white over a horizon line, will have to choose: run, hide, or join a fight their orders don't cover. Their specials become relevant in a way nobody wanted. In Washington and Moscow, the next moves stack like dominoes tipped by adrenaline. SAC bombers already on airborne alert press toward their failsafe points. Polaris submarines in the Atlantic receive quiet instructions to stand ready for tasking. The Kremlin weighs answering at sea with sea or answering at land with land. Strike Guantanamo. Signal with an airburst over water. Each path assumes the other side can read intent through the glare. Civilians step into the blast radius without seeing it. East Coast cities hear civil defense sirens tested for real. Highways clog as families try to buy 2 days of safety with 4 tanks of gas. In Miami, parents pull kids from school. In Norfolk, sailors' wives dig into closets for radios and candles. The time horizon shrinks to hours measured in television bulletins and rumors. A false report of a warhead inbound could trigger decisions no one can call back. Meanwhile, something else breaks, the back channel. During the actual crisis, messages crawl toward a trade, missiles for missiles, face for face. In this branch, the first nuclear detonation at sea vaporizes the tone. Every line burns hotter. Khrushchev's caution wrestles with hawks who argue that hesitation is surrender. Kennedy's caution wrestles with a navy that's bleeding and an air force with plans ready to launch. The quiet voices lose breath. The spiral tightens. A US retaliation at sea, whether a nuclear depth charge or a crushing conventional kill, becomes the second nuclear use in minutes. The Soviet answer, to avoid humiliation, likely shifts ashore. Strike a base. Demonstrate commitment. Then the American map expands from the Caribbean to targets that glow on wall boards. Limited war, the phrase that haunted theorists, reveals itself as a rumor. Each step is taken by people convinced they're restraining themselves. Each step looks like a message that can be read. It can't. Shock fronts travel faster than language. A 10-kiloton choice underwater becomes a light in the sky that blinds both sides long enough for habit to take over. Arkhipov's restraint didn't solve the crisis. It did something rarer. It kept the first blast from writing the rest of the script. Resolution above the waves, deals, faces, and fallout. On land, the story wore suits. In Washington, photographs of missile sites in Cuba slid across tables, while phrases like mutual assured destruction stayed unspoken but present, like a loaded gun under the cloth. Kennedy's team shaped a trade behind the speeches. Missiles out of Cuba for Jupiter missiles out of Turkey, with timing and face-saving built into the margins. In Moscow, Khrushchev weighed letters against generals, then chose the letter that could be read in daylight. At sea, restraint had a soundtrack, diesels rumbling low, searchlights ticking as they traversed, bullhorns that stuck to warnings instead of threats. The US Navy kept the quarantine, harassing but not harming, tightening boxes around contacts, and then stepping back just enough. B-59 and her sister boats were herded without being hunted to kill. Crews on both sides learned a choreography none of them wanted to dance again. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the cables you never see. Messages moved through back channels that avoided titles, routed through journalists and relatives of diplomats, through embassies that could deny if asked. A promise took shape. If you remove the hardware that terrifies us, well, remove the hardware that embarrasses you. The public would hear one part, the other would live in a drawer for years. This was the moment everything changed in the capital's tone. Announcements softened from brink to outcome. Khrushchev sent a broadcast offering to withdraw missiles under UN supervision. Kennedy responded with a letter that sounded like resolve and read like acceptance. The world exhaled through 1,000 radios. On the waterline, faces stayed tight. US destroyer captains logged the encounter with B-59 as a successful signal and a professional containment. They praised crews for keeping fingers off triggers while making sure the other man felt the grip. On B-59, Arkhipov kept the deck orderly and the radio quiet, then took the boat back under with a battery they could trust and a crew that could finally sleep hard enough to dream. Soviet Navy headquarters ran its own calculus. The internal review noted risks taken, discipline maintained, and technical limits breached by necessity. But the subtext was sharper. Captains who let themselves be seen would answer for it. A few reprimands circulated, attached to words like caution and vigilance. The praise for restraint traveled person to person, not paper to paper. Archipov's path didn't kink into celebrity. He continued the career he'd been building, staff roles, command responsibilities, coursework that assumed a mind for procedure and a spine for ambiguity. Peers treated him with the kind of respect that doesn't need a medal to make it real. He asked the same questions he'd asked since K-19, and younger officers learned to bring him answers before he asked. Unknown to most, the Americans filed after-action notes that read like engineering. Decibel levels, spacing between practice depth charges, flight altitudes for intimidation passes. They tuned their instrument without admitting the music nearly broke the audience. The not kill doctrine got refinements, but nowhere did it say the other side hadn't received the memo about signals. This was the quiet fallout. Both sides claimed steadiness. Each narrative carried its own truth. The US pointed to a quarantine that forced negotiation without battle. The Soviet side pointed to a pledge that Jupiter missiles, obsolete but symbolically loaded, would go away. In each version, toughness worked. In neither version did anyone name the moment a submerged vote cleared the way for any of it to matter. Men who'd stood in those rooms and on those decks carried a different ledger. A US sonar operator remembered the tremor in the return when a sub finally rose. A Soviet torpedoman remembered the sound of safeties re-engaging. Those aren't policy points, they're human receipts. By the time letters were archived and ships rotated home, the crisis had been officially resolved. The ocean kept its secrets. The boats that almost wrote a new history slid back into routine patrols, carrying the same weapons under slightly different rules. The deal reduced launches and headlines. It didn't reduce humidity in a foxtrot or the way pride feels when a spotlight finds you. Arkhipov took the lesson he always kept. In systems designed for decisive moves, the most decisive act can be to stall the blow long enough for a door to open somewhere else. Meaning, human judgment, inside doomsday systems. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The system didn't save anyone. A person did. Deterrence looks clean on a diagram, arrows, thresholds, escalation ladders. But ladders wobble when the rungs are human nerves and vague orders. In B-59's control room, the doomsday machine routed through one man's breath, one word, one habit: verify. Systems versus people sounds academic, until you feel concussions in your ribs. The submarine was a machine inside a larger machine. Command chains, protocols, doctrines that promised rationality at the edge. Yet every link depended on judgment. The American not-kill doctrine assumed the other side recognized a courtesy when it felt like violence. The Soviet launch rule assumed 3 mines would act as a brake. Both were right, but only because people carried the weight the systems offloaded. Ambiguity killed first. Orders said if fired upon, if war begins. What counts as fired upon when searchlights rake the waves, airbursts slap the conning tower, and practice charges hammer plates? At desks, words have edges. At depth, they smudge. That smudge is how a captain hears permission where headquarters thought it had placed caution. That smudge is how a political officer hears duty where prudence lived the day before. What nobody knew at the time is how close redundancy came to being theater. Unanimous consent sounds robust, 3 keys, not 1. But group dynamics under heat can turn 3 into echo. The captain brings urgency, the commissar brings ideology, the third brings memory or momentum. Change that third ingredient and the fuse burns through. Archipov's habit was skepticism. He'd seen fear masquerade as clarity aboard K-19. He installed a delay line where the circuit demanded speed. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the larger machine. Command and control in 1962 ran on copper, couriers, and hope. Blackouts weren't bugs, they were baked in. That forced local interpretation, which is a nice phrase for people guessing under stress. You can hear it in every later doctrine tweak, more secure links, clearer signals, tighter row. But none of that removes the moment when a tired officer translates bangs into policy and decides what those bangs mean. The redundancy myth dies hard. We tell ourselves that multiple checks, fail-safes, and authorizations will keep the worst from happening. They help until they root through the same bad assumptions. The American side layered restraint, practiced depth charges, active sonar as a nudge, strict orders not to harm. The Soviet side layered restraint, last resort weapons, unanimous consent, political oversight. Both almost failed because their designers didn't model humidity, humiliation, and rumor as variables. Here's where the modern echo rings. Today's comms are faster, sensors are denser, and software does the first draft of judgment. Cyber fog replaces salt fog. Autonomous systems interpret intent with code written by tired humans under deadlines. A mislabeled training file becomes a target. A spoofed signal looks like an attack. The ocean of ambiguity is wider. We just sail it faster. So what keeps us upright? The human element we pretend to distrust. Courage isn't only running forward, it's refusing to be carried by momentum. Skepticism isn't only doubt, it's the discipline to say wait when every alarm screams go. Arkhipov embodied both, not because he was a saint, but because he paid in scars for moving too fast in a different crisis. He had a model for fear and a muscle memory for pause. This was the moment everything changed in how the story should be read. It isn't a fable about one perfect decision defeating a wicked machine. It's a case study in designing systems that expect humans to fail well, by giving them room to question, incentives to stall, and authority to override when the script runs hot. Unanimous consent mattered because it handed veto to the calmest voice in the room. It could have backfired. It didn't this time. That variance is the space where policy lives. Meanwhile, we should talk about signals. The memo that never reached the Foxtrots turned de-escalation into escalation. That's not a footnote. It's the headline for anyone writing row now. If your adversary can't read your cues, your restraint becomes pressure, and pressure is indistinguishable from attack at 200 meters. The fix isn't cleverer signals. It's out-of-band channels that survive noise and doctrine that assumes misunderstanding. The takeaway lands simple and heavy. The world's survival can hinge on someone willing to say, wait. But waiting isn't passive. It's an active skill under fire, counting down a firing sequence, reopening safeties, insisting on air before answers, forcing facts into a room that's run out of them. Build that into training. Reward it in evaluations. Protect it in rules that give real veto power at the edge. In the end, the doomsday system didn't have a soul. The people did. They gave the machine a chance to stop. One man took it, That's not comfort, it's instruction. Aftermath and recognition. Slow, quiet justice. Recognition didn't arrive with parades. It came late, in odd rooms with careful words. Years after that night, conferences in Moscow and Washington started stitching together what had been lived in heat and silence. A historian would stand, clear his throat, and say, "A Soviet officer insisted on surfacing before firing." Then a slide would show a face most people had never seen. The room would go quiet in a way that felt like respect finding its target. Late honors trickled in. NGOs that make a habit of spotlighting unglamorous courage handed Archipov's family plaques and phrases like "Save the World" without firing a shot. The Future of Life Award named him openly, a bureaucratic phrase turned into a eulogy with weight. Officers who'd heard the story in fragments nodded, as if the public announcement finally matched their private ledger. Crew testimonials started hesitant, then deepened. A torpedoman who'd stared at the firing circuit admitted that the Veto had saved him from a lifetime of living with a launch. A medic said he'd watched men come back from the edge with the first breath of night air and had wondered later whose voice bought those seconds. Another sailor, older now, said flat, "He saved us too. Not just the Americans, not just abstractions, us in that hull." Cultural footnotes followed. The documentaries with earnest narrators, the magazine spreads with grainy photos, the panels where veterans drew careful lines around memory. A few memorials tried to fix the feeling in bronze and stone. Still, the name never reached the saturation of generals and presidents. He existed in a smaller, truer registry. People who care about the hour between concussions and breathing and the weight of a word like no. For his family, recognition was complicated. For decades, they'd lived with a quiet man who took early trains, read technical manuals at the table, and didn't tell war stories. After he was gone, strangers arrived to say that his refusal had kept their children from growing up in fallout. Pride mingled with the strangeness of rediscovering a life you thought you knew. They learned phrases like unanimous consent and T5 in the same breath as condolences. Meanwhile, the institutions that could have shouted kept their voices down. The Soviet Navy's archives opened enough for historians to trace the outline, not enough to invite a full reckoning. American After Action reports stayed proud of restraint without revising the assumption that signals would be read as intended. Justice, such as it was, moved slowly because it had to share space with institutional self-protection. This was the quiet justice, not a medal on a chest, but a place in the story that couldn't be edited out anymore. When people spoke about Black Saturday, they started adding a submarine to the map and a vote to the list of near misses. Archipov's colleagues, though still alive, began to tell younger officers why verification matters more than velocity. The lesson traveled better than the applause. There's a cost to slow justice. The person it belongs to isn't there to feel it, but it lands where it needs to, in training syllabi, in command briefings, in the habits of officers who will have their own worst hours. The crater that never existed needed a name to stand in for it. Over time, that name found its way onto lips that make decisions. That's not spectacle, that's repair. The cost of saying no. One calm refusal, at depth and under pressure, stopped a blast from writing the rest of the crisis. If you want more untold Cold War moments where a single decision bent history's arc, subscribe and watch our deep dive on the KGB mole who exposed every Soviet sub. For today's echo of this standoff, watch our episode on the F-35's hidden vulnerabilities. New War Room stories weekly.